Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole eventually gets us to the purpose of police and the surprising origins of cantors. But, as always, we have to get there. Before we start, I just want to let you know, for those of you who enjoyed the guide for the board that I released last year for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I'm working on a new booklet for this year, and if you'd like to make a donation or dedication, please go to creativejudaism.com/donate. Okay, let's get started. This week's Torah portion, Parshah Shoftim, has a lot of interesting stuff in it. But the thing that jumped out at me is right at the very beginning of the Parsha, in the very first verse. It says, Shoftim v'shoitrim titin lacha b'chol sharecha. You shall set up judges and police officers for yourself in all your cities that the Lord your God is giving you. So this verse is interesting to me because obviously justice and judges are very important in Judaism. That makes sense to me. But here it seems to be placing judges and police together on a similar level of importance, which seems like it's worth looking into. But also, something that I've always wondered about every time I read this is, what exactly are the police here? What's their job? What do they do?
There are over 5,000 men in this city who know that being a policeman is an endless, glamourless, thankless job that's got to be done.
Is it the same thing as what I think of when I think of police? So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts, with police and what their role in Judaism is. If you're ready to see where that leads, let's dive in. Okay, we'll start with Rashi, who right off the bat explains the word shoitrim, police, as something a little bit different than when you might think of when you hear the word police. He says that the judges are the people who make legal rulings. Okay, that's straightforward. And the shoitrim, the police officers, follow the commands of the judges and force people with a stick and a strap to accept the rulings of the judge. So according to Rashi, it sounds like the police aren't their own thing who are driving around the streets looking for people who are making illegal U-turns, but rather they're an extension of the judges. Their sole purpose is to make sure that when the judges rule that a specific person has to pay a fine or something, that they actually do it. And if you look at the English translation of Rashi from Sefaria, you'll see that when it quotes the verse, it translates the word shoitrim not as police, the way it's usually translated, but as bailiff, which refers to an officer who is specifically associated with the courts.
All rise. I have prepared myself for any contingency.
Which makes sense based on how Rashi explains it. So most sources interpret this as meaning that the shoitrim are an extension of the judges, doing whatever the judges say. So the judges are the main thing, and then they have these officers to help them enforce their rulings. But Ibn Ezra gives this role a little more oomph. He says that shoitrim comes from the word mishtar, meaning authority or dominion, and he calls them moishlim, which means rulers. Mizrahi explains this a little bit more and says that according to this approach, the shoitrim are the ones with the real power, and the judges only have the ability to interpret the law and give guidance, but they don't have the authority to make anybody do anything. So this seems a little bit different than Rashi, who says that the officers follow the commands of the judges. But he explains that you could actually make this approach work with Rashi and say that command doesn't really mean command, and what Rashi really meant was that they follow the guidance and instruction of the judges. Mizrahi then goes on to offer the approach that we said before about the officers just being employees of the court, and it seems like that's the one that he thinks is more likely. So based on this, we've got two ways of looking at these police, which actually gives us two completely different ways of looking at judges in Judaism. Either the judges are the main seat of power in Judaism, and they have officers to help them enforce their rulings.
You can tell that to the judge.
The judge!
Or the judges are just an advisory board for the real authority, which is the police. Which is fascinating to me because I've always thought of Judaism as being primarily driven by deliberation and thought. And it's interesting to flip it and think of Judaism as a police state. Okay, so there's another verse that mentions shoitrim a little earlier on in Parshas Devarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu, or Moses, is talking about how he set up the Jewish leadership structure. It says, I took the heads of your tribes, men wise and well-known, and I made them heads over you. Leaders over thousands, leaders over hundreds, leaders over 50s, and leaders over 10s. The shoitrim l'shivtechem, and officers for your tribes. Rashi interprets Shoftim here pretty similarly to how he did it in our Parshah, but he kind of separates it from the list of leadership positions listed at the beginning of the verse and makes it a separate thing. Maskil LeDavid, which is a commentary on Rashi, points this out and says that this seemingly barely significant wording actually tells us something important. He says that Rashi is trying to tell us that all this stuff at the beginning of the verse about the leaders being wise doesn't apply to the Shoftim. He says that it wouldn't make sense that the police officers have to have all of the virtuous qualities that are demanded of judges. And then he adds, even according to the opinion that the people who administer punishments should be lacking in strength and be exceedingly knowledgeable, even then, it wouldn't be as much as we expect from the judges. So a couple of things jumped out at me about this. First of all, now besides for the different ways of looking at the hierarchical relationship between judges and police, there's also a difference in character. According to this, we expect judges to be wise and fair and knowledgeable, but we don't expect all of those things from police.
John Law, you're the fuzz, the heat, you're poison, you're trouble, you're bad news.
Also, even though Rashi already mentioned that these police officers are equipped with a stick and a whip, it could have just been that that was just for forcing people to pay fines. But now, according to the thing at the end there, it seems like part of the duties of these police officers is to administer the corporal punishments ruled by the court, which makes the role even more distinct from what I perceive the role of police to be today. But there was one more thing about this that was interesting to me about that last part, which is that opinion about the whipping guy needing to be weak and smart. I dug around a little bit and found that that comes from the Talmud. It says in the name of the rabbis of the Mishnaic era that the attendants appointed for this should be lacking in strength and exceedingly knowledgeable. And then Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says that that's not necessary and it's okay if they are not very knowledgeable and are very strong. So that's an interesting idea, that even the people whose job it is to be violent should be weak and smart. And it kind of flips the priorities back to how I'm used to thinking about them in Judaism. But something else that was interesting to me was that the word that's used for these attendants is chazan, which in its modern usage usually refers to cantors, the people who stand at the front of the synagogue and sing.
Larry! We got a cantor already. It's okay, though.
What? Can I be the new cantor?
Now, I wasn't surprised by the way the Mishnah and Gemara used the word. It comes up in a bunch of different places referring to various types of communal roles. It basically means overseer, someone who's in charge of some sort of service to the community. For example, there's a Gemara that mentions Chazane Masa, which means the night watchman of a city. So Chazan is just a general term that covers a lot of different communal jobs, and now we just use it for one specific communal role, the cantor. But I was wondering how exactly the development of this word works, and whether today's cantor is just a cousin of the corporal punishment dudes, or maybe a direct descendant. I mentioned this to some friends, and they were pretty certain that it's the former. Chazan used to mean a lot of different things, including both the whipping guys and the people who led communal prayer services, and eventually the whipping guy became obsolete, and the communal prayer role developed into a guy with a funny hat singing with an opera voice. But even though they had a lot of compelling arguments and are probably right, I really want it to be that chazan used to mean people who did all of that stuff, and eventually the whipping part of their job became obsolete, and the prayer part became their only role. Which would mean that today's cantors aren't just the cousins of the whipping guys, they're the direct successors of the whipping guys, which I think would be funny. Okay, back to the role of police and the relationship with the judges.
In my business, this sign means something whether you drive or not. Sometimes, if you don't heed it, you'll see this sign. I work here. I carry a badge.
There's a midrash that says that the reason why these two roles are mentioned together in this week's Torah portion is because im ein shoiter ein shofet. If there's no police, then there is no judge. And then it goes on and explains that if a judge rules that someone has to pay money to somebody else, but there's no police around to make them actually do it, then the judge has no power. So if there's no police, then there's no judge. So according to this, even if the job of the judges is more central to Judaism and the police are kind of peripheral to that, even then, the ability for the judges to exist in any meaningful way depends on the existence of the police. But Bartenura takes that a step further and makes it go both ways. He says that since the whole job of the police is to enforce the rulings of the judges, then if there are no judges, there's no point in having police. So we had the midrash that said that if there's no police, then effectively there's no judges. And now the Bartenura taking it the other way as well, that if there's no judges, then there's no point in having police.
I'm saying the cops, they can advise us on this. I'm saying call a professional.
No,
No cops.
Which is an interesting idea to me, because you might think that if you don't have judges, at least you should still have police to keep some sort of order. But it seems like Bartenura is implying that the Jewish concept of police is something that can't exist on its own without the guidance and instruction of judges. But the Orach Chaim puts a different spin on this idea that I thought was fascinating. He quotes the Midrash that if there are no police, then there are no judges, and he says that that means that if there are no police, then there is no obligation at all to appoint judges. So it's not just that the judges will be ineffective, but that the Torah obligation to appoint judges depends on there being police who are able to enforce their rulings. But then he says that if there's a time when everybody follows the rulings of the judges without the need for any police to enforce it, then we're obligated to appoint the judges, and those judges are called both a judge and a police officer. So to me, this takes that idea of the police being an accessory to the judges and just takes it all the way home. That in an ideal world, it's just judges, and the role of the police gets automatically fulfilled by default. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. I hope you don't get stopped by the rabbit cops on the way out.